She spat in the sheriff's face, so they tied her to the fence post, said it'd teach her not to deny a man his God-given rights. But she didn't beg, didn't cry, just waited, for the outlaw she once spared, praying he'd remember her mercy. The blood had dried in the dirt beneath her feet, and still they left her there, hands bound rough with hemp, sun blistering her shoulders, wind cracking her lips until she tasted iron every time she swallowed. Ruth Caldwell didn't scream. That was the part that unsettled them most. From the moment Sheriff Holt ordered her tied, like livestock, like something less than human, she hadn't made a sound. Not when they stripped her coat. Not when the crowd jeered and spat and called her spinster trash. And not when Holt pressed the marriage papers into her palm and whispered that this was the price of disobedience. She looked him dead in the eye and tore them in half. So now here she stood, splinters digging into her spine, waiting for the hours to pass and the next cruelty to arrive. Holt had said she'd break before nightfall. But the sun had long since sunk, and Ruth Caldwell had not broken. They left her facing the gallows, said it'd help her reconsider. She knew better. There was no reconsidering a man like Sheriff Holt, thick-necked, sunburned, always smelling of sweat and spoiled whiskey. He wanted ownership, not affection. Her hand wasn't what he wanted. It was her land. 40 acres her father had worked until it killed him. Land with water, land Holt needed. And when Ruth refused to sign it over in marriage, he didn't take no. He took her freedom. By morning, her hands were numb, her wrists swollen purple from the rope. A pair of crows had landed nearby, eyeing her with idle interest. A few townsfolk passed. Some averted their eyes, some didn't. But no one helped. That's how it worked in Brimrock. Everyone too scared of Holt, or too far gone to care. It wasn't until the third morning that something changed. He rode in quiet. No fanfare, no posse. Just a lone figure on a coal-black horse, dust rising around him like smoke. He didn't look like much. Just another drifter with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. But Ruth knew the set of those shoulders. The way he dismounted like the ground owed him something. The scar under his left eye caught the light. Her breath caught. Colt, she rasped before she meant to. Colt McCall hadn't been seen in Brimrock for 2 years, not since Holt put a bounty on his head, and every gun hand in the territory came sniffing for blood. But none of them had found him. Ruth had. In her barn. Bleeding out, ribs cracked, eyes wild. And instead of turning him in, she stitched him up. Fed him. Hid him until he could ride again. He never said thank you, just vanished before dawn one morning and never came back, until now. He saw her, reined in hard. For a second he didn't move, just stared at her tied there, wind tearing at her dress, her chin lifted in defiance. And then he dismounted. The townsfolk scattered like dry leaves. Colt walked through them like they weren't there. Holt stepped out onto the porch of the jailhouse, badge gleaming. He smiled, slow and cruel. Well, well, Holt drawled, arms open wide like he was welcoming an old friend. Ain't this a reunion? Colt didn't stop walking. Holt's fingers drifted toward his holster. You here to collect on that bounty, McCall, he said, too loud, eyes flicking toward the watching crowd. Or maybe just tired of running. Still, Colt said nothing. He stopped 3 feet from Ruth, looked her over. The bruises, the cracked lips, the way her dress had torn down one side, his jaw clenched. You look like hell, he said finally. Ruth gave a dry, rasping laugh. Been worse. He turned then, looked straight at Holt. Untie her. Holt laughed. Or what? That was when the shooting started. It was over in seconds. Colt moved like he'd never left the killing behind. One shot to the deputy on the porch, another for the one crouched behind the watering trough. Holt drew, but Colt already had him in his sights. Ruth didn't flinch. When the bullet hit the sheriff square in the shoulder, spinning him sideways with a cry. The crowd screamed and fled. Colt stepped forward, tore the ropes loose with a hunting knife. Ruth sagged but stayed standing, always standing. You got a horse? He asked. Not anymore, she muttered. Then ride with me. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. The sound of more riders in the distance told her everything she needed to know. They rode hard, side by side, through scrub and dust and heat, Ruth holding tight as the wind stole the air from her lungs. Her hands ached, her shoulders screamed, but she didn't let go, not until they were miles from Brimrock and the hills rose high enough to break the horizon. They stopped beneath a rocky outcrop. Colt dismounted first, offered her a hand. She took it, her legs buckled. He caught her. You should have run, she said, trying to stand straight. Didn't sit right, he muttered. What? Knowing what they'd done to you. She studied his face. Hard angles, shadowed eyes. The same man she'd patched together with shaking hands and whispered prayers. But there was something different now. A gravity. A purpose. You came back, she whispered. He nodded. You spared me once. Figured I owed you the same. Silence fell. Then a sound. Soft, distant, but wrong. Hoofbeats. They followed us, she said. Colt's eyes scanned the ridgeline. Not Holt's men. Then who? Another sound. A whistle, long and sharp. Colt froze. Dawson, he said, the name like ash in his mouth. Ruth stared. Dawson? I thought you killed him. Guess he's harder to bury than I thought. Gunfire echoed off the rocks. Colt grabbed Ruth, pulling her behind the boulders, just as bullets chewed through the air above them. Stay down, he barked, but she was already pulling the pistol from Colt's saddlebag. I'm not sitting this out. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time he didn't see a woman who needed saving. He saw an equal, and maybe that was what scared him most. The shots came faster now, ricocheting off stone and whistling past Ruth's ear like angry hornets. She ducked lower behind the boulder, the pistol clenched tight in her hand, though her fingers still trembled. Colt flattened himself beside her, eyes narrowed, calculating. 3 shooters, maybe 4. They had the high ground, at least for now, and the late afternoon sun lit them up like ghosts above the ridge. Colt's hand went to the rifle slung across his back, and when he turned, to her his voice had dropped into something cold, focused. They're flanking us. Fast. I'm not afraid of dying, Ruth said, before she could think to stop herself. He gave her a glance sharp as a blade. Then you ain't thinking hard enough. Another bullet chipped stone inches from her boot. Colt grabbed her by the wrist and dragged her toward a narrow slit between the rocks. They squeezed through just as more gunfire shattered the ledge where they'd been crouched. The crevice led into a shallow gully, half dry, half choked with thornbush. They dropped down, into it, crawling through the scrub like hunted animals. Ruth's dress snagged, tore, blood welled on her arms where the brambles bit, but she didn't stop. Didn't speak. Just kept moving. A voice called from above, mocking, too loud to be Holt's men. Colt McCall! You really thought you'd crawl out of hell without me? Ruth looked to him. His jaw had gone tight, like it hurt to breathe. Dawson, he muttered again, the word tasting like poison. He was supposed to be gone. Who is he? She asked, breath coming hard. My brother. That stopped her cold. Before, she could press him. Another volley of shots drove them further down the gulch. They followed the gully as it twisted west, until the terrain evened out and the gunfire faded into wind. Colt led them toward a grove of cottonwoods, where the shadows ran long and the earth dipped into a dry wash. He yanked the saddlebags off, the horse, and dumped out a canteen, a cracked map, a rusted tin of beans, and 2 boxes of ammunition. They dropped to the dirt beneath the trees, Ruth's legs folding beneath her. She felt like a raw wound, every inch of her scraped, bruised, or bloodied. Colt took one look at her, then knelt beside her without a word. He pulled a knife and cut away what was left of the rope burns on her wrists, cleaned them with water, wrapped them in a torn shirt sleeve. He didn't speak, and neither did she. Not until he finally sat back, hands bloody. Why now? She asked. Why come back? He didn't meet her eyes. Because I heard what Holt did, what they were planning, and I remembered what you said that night in the barn. You told me not every man was born to be wicked, that some just forgot how to be good. She blinked. She hadn't known he'd remembered that. I tried to forget you, he said quietly. But you were the only one who looked at me like I was still worth saving. She turned her face from him then, not from shame, but because tears were close, and she hated that, hated feeling anything near him. Dawson'll follow, Colt said after a while. He's always been like that, couldn't stand not being the one in charge. When I ran, he made it his mission to be worse than me, bloodier, meaner. Now he's here to finish it. Ruth's eyes snapped to his. You're saying this is about you? No, he said quiet. It's about us. She stood then, pacing. Colt, I didn't ask for this. I didn't want to be dragged into your past. I've got my own battles. He stood too, close. You think I don't know that? But they're coming either way. Dawson wants blood, and he'll spill yours to get at mine. I can take care of myself. I know. That's the part that scares me. She stared at him, fists clenched. Then don't stand in my way. He didn't move as she brushed past him. Night fell hard. They built no fire. The horse grazed nearby, while Colt sat with the rifle across his knees, and Ruth kept watch, with the pistol resting in her lap. The wind changed. Coyotes howled in the distance. Stillness settled, tense and uneasy. Ruth didn't sleep. She couldn't. Every snap of a twig sent her heart pounding. Every shadow was a ghost from her past. At some point, Colt spoke. When I left you, he said, not looking at her, I was already bleeding, inside. I'd killed men who didn't deserve it, robbed coaches I didn't need to. My hands were red, long before you found me, and I thought if I stayed, I'd drag you under with me. She said nothing. I figured if I vanished, you'd forget me. Move on, find someone better. I did forget, she lied. He smiled bitterly. You always were the best liar in Brimrock. Before she could reply, the horse snorted, ears flicking. Colt stood, rifle raised. Then came the whistle. High, sharp, unmistakable. They both froze. I know that sound, Ruth whispered. From the barn. 2 short, 1 long. It's a signal. Colt's face darkened. Dawson! The next moment, gunfire lit up the grove. They ran, through trees, over rocks. Bullets kicked up dirt at their heels. Ruth stumbled once. Colt grabbed her arm, kept her moving. They crested a ridge and slid down the other side into another dry ravine. No words, just survival. They holed up in a cave not 20 yards deep, hidden behind a curtain of roots. Colt posted watch. Ruth sat with her back to the stone wall, legs drawn up, breathing shallow. Why did you spare me? He asked finally. She looked at him. All those years ago, you could have turned me in, could have bought yourself a way out of Brimrock. She didn't answer at first. Then, because I saw something in your eyes. What? Regret. He nodded slowly. That was the first thing you ever gave me. A second chance. The cave was silent a long time after that. When morning came, Ruth crept to the mouth of the cave. She saw tracks. Too many. Dawson's men had circled, looking for them, then ridden east, toward the old mining camp. She turned to Colt. We can't keep running. I know. So what's the plan? He looked at her, eyes unreadable. We take the fight to them. She blinked. Just the 2 of us? He grinned, and for the first time she saw a flicker of who he used to be before the blood, before the scars. No, he said. We'll need help. They rode north, toward a name Ruth hadn't spoken in years. Her uncle, Joseph Greer, a drunk, a gambler, but once a leader of men during the border wars. He lived out past the mesas, where the land cracked and the law went thin. If anyone would remember a Caldwell favor, it was him. They reached Greer's place by nightfall, 3 shacks and a dying windmill. Greer met them at the door with a Shotgun. Ruthie, he said, blinking. Last time I saw you, you was 12 and punching a preacher. I need help, she said without preamble. Greer looked at Colt, then back to her. Outlaw trouble? Worse, she said. Family trouble. He stared, then nodded. Come in. The shack smelled of kerosene and old tobacco. Greer poured whiskey into tin mugs and listened as Ruth laid it all out. Holt. The fence post. Colt Dawson. When she finished, he leaned back, fingers steepled. I got 6 boys left who still know how to shoot, and I still owe your daddy for saving my hide in Black Rock. I'll ride. Relief spread through her chest like fire, but Greer's eyes turned grim. But you gotta understand something. If Dawson's anything like his brother, he paused, nodding toward Colt. This won't end clean. It never does, Ruth said. They set out at dawn, 10 riders total, hard men, scarred and quiet, but loyal to Greer. They rode south through arroyos and dry gulches, tracking Dawson's trail. At the old mine, they found signs, spent shells, burned coals, horse dung. Fresh. That night, Ruth stood watch with Colt, staring into the fireless dark. Once this is over, she said, what'll you do? Don't know, he answered. Never thought that far. You could come back. He looked at her. To Brimrock? No. To me. He didn't answer. But he didn't walk away either. And somewhere in the dark, Dawson was watching, planning, waiting to tear them both apart. They spotted the buzzards first, circling low over the gulch like black sails caught in a slow wind. Ruth reined her horse in and narrowed her eyes against the morning glare, the sun not yet high enough to blind her. Colt came up beside her and followed her gaze, already knowing. Buzzards didn't circle nothing. Something down there was dead, or about to be. Greer lifted his rifle and pointed with the barrel. That's the edge of Dawson's territory. He's not hiding. He's waiting. Colt spit in the dust. He always liked games. Greer shook his head, mouth drawn in a line. Only kind of game Dawson knows ends with someone bled out in the dirt. They rode on, slower now. The land grew sharper, angrier. Cactus rose like jagged teeth and the wind picked up, hissing through the stones like it knew what was coming. Ruth could feel it pressing on her chest, something low and coiled and ancient. The air here wasn't right. It was too still, too heavy. The trail narrowed into a dry riverbed and the group dropped into it, horses crunching over shale and bone. The carcass of a mule lay half picked apart to the right. Its ribs jutted like knives from torn hide, and Ruth turned her head from the smell. Greer's boys stayed tight. No one talking now, just eyes scanning, hands on rifles. They were outnumbered, and they all knew it. When the shot came, it wasn't from the ridge, it came from behind. One of Greer's men, a wiry kid named Nolan, pitched off his saddle with a scream, blood jetting from his throat. His horse bolted. Before the others could even shout, the canyon echoed with a second crack, and then a third. Another rider down. Then, chaos. Ambush! Colt roared, already off his horse, dragging Ruth down with him as bullets ripped through the air. They scrambled behind a boulder, just as lead tore through the spot where they'd stood. Horses screamed, riders cursed, dust exploded around them. Ruth fumbled for her pistol, ears ringing. She caught sight of Greer diving behind a jutting. Slab, firing back with the calm precision of a man who'd spent years in places like this. Dawson's men? She gasped. Colt answered by sighting his rifle and letting off 2 quick shots. One of them hit. She saw a figure collapse from the rocks above, tumbling down in a mess of limbs and dust. They cut us off, Colt said. They were waiting for us to cross in. How many? Don't know. More than us. Another of Greer's men screamed, hit in the gut. Ruth's stomach turned, but she bit it down. There was no room for softness here. No room for anything but survival. She steadied her breath, rose just enough to fire 2 shots toward the shadows where movement flickered. She didn't know if she hit anything. Didn't care. She had to keep them back. Then she saw him. On the far ridge, above the chaos, just standing there like a judge at the gallows, Dawson. He was broader than Colt, with a beard that looked more like a snarl than anything man-grown. His hat sat low, but Ruth could see the curve of his mouth, smiling. He lifted a hand and pointed, straight at her. Colt saw it too. "He wants you alive." "Why?" He didn't answer, just grabbed her arm. "We move. Now." They crawled down the ravine as the gunfight raged. Ruth's arms ached. Her knees were raw, but she didn't stop, didn't slow. A scream cut short behind them. Someone else dead. The rest of Greer's men were pinned. They had to split off, or they'd all be buried here. They found a narrow cleft, barely wide enough to squeeze through, and Colt led her into the shadows. It was quieter here, though the sounds of dying still echoed beyond. They climbed higher until they reached a ledge that overlooked the canyon. Greer was still fighting. Down to 3 men, maybe 2. One was dragging another behind cover. The whole rest were gone. Ruth wanted to go back. "We can't help them now," Colt said, voice hoarse. "You're just going to let them die. If we die, everything dies with us." She hated that he was right, but hate didn't change the truth. They moved north, deeper into a craggy bluff riddled with old mining shafts. The sun was high now, beating down like a punishment. They took shelter in a collapsed tunnel, the timber groaning under its own weight. Inside, it smelled like dust and old blood. Ruth sat hard on the stone floor, back against the wall, breathing like she'd run miles. Colt paced like a caged wolf. "He's not just after me," she said finally. "Is he?" Colt stopped. His face was a knot of guilt and something worse, fear. "He's after what I took from him." "Which was?" Colt looked away. "His wife." Silence. "You what?" "She came to me. Said he was beating her near to death. Said she needed a way out. I gave her one. Rode her across the border. Found her a new name. Told her to never look back." Ruth stared at him. "And he thinks she's with you still. He thinks I stole her, that I killed her." "Did you?" "No," Colt said, and his voice broke with it. "But maybe I should have. Maybe then he'd have stopped chasing ghosts." She didn't know what to say. The world felt too small, all of a sudden, and the danger too big. But then Colt turned back to her, crouching low, meeting her eyes. "He wants to use you to bring me in, but he doesn't know you like I do. You're not bait. You're fire. He'll burn before you break." Her throat tightened, but before either of them could say more, a voice echoed down from above. "Well now," it drawled. "Ain't this sweet, Dawson?" Colt yanked her up and shoved her deeper into the mine as footsteps crunched outside. "I smell guilt and desperation," Dawson called. "Smells like McCall." Ruth clutched her pistol and Colt loaded another round. Dawson kept talking. "You think she's gonna save you? That little Spitfire ain't nothing but kindling." And I got the match. Then something hit the tunnel wall. Hard. "Smoke," Colt cursed. "He's burning us out." The dry timbers caught fast. In seconds, the tunnel filled with choking grey. Colt wrapped a scarf around Ruth's mouth and dragged her toward a back shaft, a crawl space barely fit for rats. "We'll suffocate," she coughed. "Not if we move fast." They crawled. The smoke chased them. The wood cracked. Fire flickered behind them like the breath of hell. Ruth coughed until her throat felt raw. Eyes streaming, then light, a break in the wall. They tumbled out the far side into blinding sun and rolling dust. Behind them, the tunnel roared and collapsed. They were alive, but not alone. Greer stood there, shirt bloodied. 2 of his men slumped on their horses. "You're lucky I know this. Land better than your outlaw here," he grunted. "Now move. They'll circle." Colt nodded, grim. We need to draw them away from the river pass. Why? Because Ruth's girls are there. She spun. What? Holt's men, the ones that tied you up. They sent word. Said if I ever came back, they'd finish what they started. Her knees buckled. My girls, we'll reach, and before night, Colt said. But only if we ride now. Ruth didn't argue, didn't breathe, just swung into the saddle and kicked the horse hard enough to fly. They rode like devils through the flats, past broken fences and coyote trails. Ruth's heart beat a scream in her chest, her daughters, her whole world. The sun dropped fast, bleeding over the hills. They reached the ridge overlooking the pass, just as the shadows stretched long. Smoke. From the cabin. No, Ruth whispered. They galloped down, the world blurred, the cabin was scorched, the door swinging. She leapt off the horse before it stopped, stumbled over ash and broken glass. Inside, nothing. No bodies. No blood. No sign of them. Then, a whisper. Ma? From the root cellar, the voice cracked and terrified. Ruth tore open the hatch and found her daughters curled together in the dark, clutching each other like lifelines. She cried out and fell to her knees, arms wrapping around them so tight they squealed. I thought, she started, but the words dissolved. Colt knelt beside them, head bowed, but then, a gun cocked behind them. Dawson stood in the doorway, smiling like he owned the end of the world. Family reunion, he said, and everything went still. He filled the doorway like a storm cloud, Dawson did. One hand rested lazily on the pistol at his side, the other dangling like he hadn't just burned a man alive and hunted down a mother and her children for sport. The firelight from the wrecked hearth danced across his beard, throwing flickers into the hard cuts of his face. He didn't raise his gun. He didn't need to. He already had them cornered. Ruth's daughters clung to her, breath hitching in their tiny throats. The older one, Leah, pressed her face into Ruth's side, and Ruth smoothed her tangled hair without taking her eyes off the man in the doorway. Colt's hand crept toward his rifle, slow as a sunrise. But Dawson saw. Don't, he said soft, as soot. You fire that thing and someone dies who don't deserve to. Colt froze, then pulled his hand back, palms up in surrender. What do you want, Dawson? Dawson stepped inside, boots crunching over glass. Same thing I've always wanted. The truth and a reckoning. Greer moved into the doorway behind him, gun aimed. Dawson didn't flinch. You fire that thing, he repeated, and you'll hit me, sure, but not before I gut him. He jabbed a thumb toward Colt. And her. His eyes shifted to Ruth, and something dark passed through his grin. You got a knack for taking what ain't yours, McCall. Women, guns, names, legacies. I didn't take your wife, Colt said, his voice strained. She left. She asked for help. I gave it. She left me for a coward, Dawson spat, stepping closer. You think that makes it better? You think helping her disappear forgives you of the sin? I think it kept her alive. Then why is she dead now? Silence fell like a rock dropped into a well. Colt looked stunned. Dawson nodded. Found her bones last. Spring in a ravine outside El Paso. Whole jaw shattered. I wonder who did that to her. Maybe some outlaw took advantage of her kindness. Maybe it was you. I never touched her. She was wearing your ring. That stopped Colt cold. His lips parted, but no words came. Ruth could see it happening, his spine stiffening, his breath catching in his throat. Grief, but not fresh grief. Old grief turned into confusion. Then into guilt. Then into something harder. She kept it, he whispered. Dawson moved in another step. You don't get to carry that. You don't get to wear sorrow like armor when you were the one who turned your back. Why are you here, Dawson? Ruth asked suddenly. Her voice cracked, but she didn't back down. Why come for me, for my girls? What did we do? He turned those sharp eyes on her. You refused a deal. You embarrassed a man who's got coin and pride. Holt wanted to break you to make an example. You walked away. That makes you dangerous. So you want me dead? I want you quiet. You, him, them. He nodded at the children. All of it, all this mess, buried. Greer shifted behind, him. You'd kill kids? Dawson glanced back. This land ain't kind to weakness. You know that, Greer. Don't act new. But Greer's hand didn't lower. Yeah, and I've seen men like you rot on crosses for less. Dawson smirked. Then maybe you ought to start praying. What happened next was too fast for Ruth to follow. A shout, a shot. Then the room erupted. Greer's rifle cracked and Dawson lunged sideways. Colt tackled Ruth and the girls behind the hearth, just as bullets tore through the room, splintering wood and setting the curtains alight. Smoke billowed. Screams rose. Dawson was gone, vanished into the dark like a devil, through smoke. Ruth pulled her girls close, their sobs muffled against her chest. Colt was already on his feet, dragging a smouldering curtain down and stomping out the embers. Greer stumbled through the doorway, bleeding from the shoulder. He's gone, Greer grunted. But he ain't done. We need to move, Colt said. Now, before he circles back with Holt's men. There's a cave system north of the ravine, Greer said, wincing. My father used to smuggle whiskey through it during the war. Could buy us some time. Ruth looked at her daughters. Their faces were pale, streaked with ash and terror. She stood, cradling one in each arm. We go, she said. Now. They rode through smoke and nightfall, every shadow feeling like a threat. The girls rode with Ruth on a single horse, Colt and Greer flanking them like walls of flesh and iron. The stars overhead blinked through black clouds, but no one looked up. No one dared. The cave mouth appeared like the open jaws of a sleeping beast. They lit no torches, only felt their way forward by memory and instinct. The girls whimpered but did not cry. Ruth's arms ached from holding them, but she didn't loosen her grip. The path twisted and narrowed, then opened into a hollow chamber smelling of moss and memory. They laid the girls down first, wrapping them in spare coats and rubbing their hands until the tremors faded. Colt sat near the entrance, listening. Greer pressed cloth to his wound, groaning low. He's unraveling, Greer said. Dawson. That wasn't vengeance. That was obsession. He thinks I killed her, Colt whispered. Maybe, Greer said. Or maybe he knows you didn't and just don't care. Maybe he just wants someone to blame. Colt looked at Ruth then, and she saw it. The shift. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't hiding. He was preparing. You brought my girls back, she said. Colt shook his head. You brought them back. I just rode alongside. No, you came for me, when no one else would. I owed you. No, she said quietly. You didn't. They didn't speak after that, not for a while. Just the sound of Greer breathing heavy, the wind outside the cave, the soft whimpers of sleeping children, until Colt stirred. They won't wait till morning, he said. Holt's men are too proud. Dawson's too mad. They'll come before dawn. Then we make our stand here? Greer asked. No, Ruth said. We make our stand there. She pointed at the old trestle bridge half a mile east, barely visible through the cave's crack in the rock. It was long, narrow, and ran over a drop deep enough to kill. A place no army could march without risk. A place one or two could hold against many. You sure? Colt asked. She nodded. If I'm going to die, I want it to be where the wind can carry my name. By first light, they were in position. Ruth left her girls hidden in the deepest part of the cave, a pistol tucked in Leah's trembling hand. If anyone but me or Colt walks through that gap, she told her, you shoot. You understand? Leah nodded, silent tears tracking her cheeks. Greer stayed behind too injured to fight but strong enough to watch over them. Ruth and Colt took the bridge. The sun broke gold over the horizon, spilling light on the valley below. And there, rising like dust devils, came the riders. 5, 10, 15, Holt's men. And at their head, Dawson, bareheaded now, long hair whipping in the wind. They didn't charge right away. They stopped at the far edge of the bridge, staring down the two figures who stood at its center. "You still got a choice," Dawson called. Colt stepped forward. "So do you." Dawson laughed. "What, you gonna shoot me from up there? Die a martyr, that what this is?" Ruth stepped beside him. "This is where you end," she said, voice clear as the mountain air. Dawson didn't laugh this time. He waved his hand. The men surged forward. Colt and Ruth opened fire. The bridge shook with thunder. Horses screamed. Men shouted. Bullets cracked. Through wood and blood. One man tumbled over the edge, his screams swallowed by the canyon. Another fell mid-charge. Then another. Still they came. Colt ducked, reloaded, fired again. Ruth's arm was numb from the recoil, her lungs burning. A bullet grazed her side. She staggered but didn't fall. Then, crack. The bridge's far post gave. The men screamed. The structure groaned. The bridge started to give. Colt grabbed Ruth and leapt back as the entire front half of the bridge collapsed, pulling 4 horses and 5 men with it into the abyss. Silence. Dust, and then Dawson's scream. It was wordless, agonized. He stood at the broken edge, staring down, breathing like an animal. Then he turned his gun on them again. Colt aimed, but Ruth was faster. 1 shot. Dawson staggered, hand to his chest. He looked down at the blood, like he didn't believe it. Then he fell. Over the edge. Gone. Ruth didn't lower her gun for a long time. Not until the sun was full in the sky and nothing stirred but the wind. They found the girl still curled in the back of the cave, asleep. Greer nodded from the wall, pale but alive. It was over, but Ruth knew better. The kind of storm Dawson brought didn't end with one fall. It echoed. It hunted. It waited. She wrapped her arms around her daughters and whispered, "We're not done, but we're together." And that was enough. For now. The wind whistled across the broken trestle, tugging loose splinters from where the bridge had splintered and fallen. The canyon below still echoed faintly with the cries of men who'd ridden to their deaths without ever touching their guns. But dawn had passed, and Ruth could no longer trust silence to mean safety. She paced the cave's mouth, while Colt and Greer gathered what little they had left. Every few steps, Ruth glanced behind her, checking the hollow where her girls still slept curled against each other in a bed of coats and hay. They hadn't stirred since dawn, but Ruth could feel the tremor building in the air again, the uneasy pull of something coming. Not Dawson, he was gone. But the fire he lit hadn't gone out. If anything, it had just spread underground, waiting to rise where they least expected. Greer had bandaged his arm as best he could, using a length of shirt and Ruth's sewing needle. His face was grey with pain, but he kept moving, one eye always, on the trail beyond the rocks. Dawson didn't ride alone, he said, not for the first time. That was just a splinter of Holt's reach. Man like that doesn't bet all his money on one dog. Colt sat beside a boulder, sharpening the edge of a hatchet he'd found in the remains of the old cabin. His eyes had been far away since Ruth told him about Dawson's claim. That his dead wife had been wearing Colt's ring when they found her bones. It shook something in him that hadn't settled since, like a door reopened to a past he'd boarded shut years ago. He hadn't spoken about it, but Ruth could feel it in the way he moved. Tighter, quieter, like a man counting the seconds before something collapsed. "What are you thinking?" Ruth asked, not gently. Colt looked up, slow. "I think Holt isn't sending men to kill you anymore. I think he's sending them to steal." She blinked. "Steal what? I've got nothing." "You've got them," he said, tipping his head toward the girls. "And Holt's the sort of man who likes revenge to echo." Ruth's mouth went dry. "He wouldn't." "He already did. You saw what Dawson did to your homestead. what he was willing to do. Holt sent him with a message. Ruth, that message wasn't just death, it was cruelty. Greer coughed and shifted, pulling his coat tighter. He's right. Holt's gone quiet before, real quiet. Last time he sent a man south with a wagon full of children. Orphans, mostly. Sold them to a mine company for food. Credits. Never even blinked. Ruth staggered to her knees beside the fire, one hand over her mouth. Why would anyone... Because it's easier to own a town when you own its fear, Colt said. Silence fell again, the kind that doesn't come from peace, but from no one knowing what to say. When Ruth finally stood, her hands were fists. We ride tonight. We don't wait for him to come again. We take the fight to Holt. Colt raised an eyebrow. That's suicide. So is waiting. He won't stop, Colt. Not until he's carved us out of the earth one by one. I've spent too many years keeping my head down, hoping the devil would forget my name, but now he's carving it into the canyon wall. Greer smiled faintly. Well, you always did have a stubborn streak, Ruth. You riding with us? She asked. If you'll have me, I'll have anyone willing to bleed beside me. They packed quick, left the cave before full dark. The girls didn't cry, though Ruth could see the confusion in Leah's eyes, the brittle fear in her younger sister's clenched jaw. They rode in shifts, Ruth sharing her mount with the girls, Colt and Greer switching between theirs, every hoofbeat echoing like a madrom. They didn't take the main trail. They rode through dry creek beds, across jagged ledges, through burned woods where nothing dared to grow. They slept in shifts, fires cold, knives ready. And still, Ruth felt the weight of time thinning behind them. Holt would know Dawson had failed by now. He would send more. It was 2 nights later, near the edge of Lockridge Bluff, when they saw the first sign. A single horse, dead and bloated, with its rider missing. Fresh blood painted the trail, but no body lay nearby. Just a hat. A boy's. Hat. Greer stared at it, unmoving. You know him? Colt asked. Greer nodded once. Apprentice messenger, from the post house outside Gorman's Gulch, would have been sent to relay word. So Holt's intercepting his own, Ruth muttered. Making sure no one else knows what's happening. They pressed on, but the mood shifted. Ruth's skin itched every mile closer to town, as if the earth itself was warning her back. Still, she didn't stop. They reached the edge of Holt's domain by dusk. Lockridge hadn't changed much. Still a cluster of clapboard buildings pretending to be a town, still the same crooked sign over the saloon, still the sound of a piano drifting from somewhere you couldn't quite find. But something had changed beneath it. The streets were empty. The lamps lit too early, and every window had its curtains drawn. They stabled the horses at the old mill and crept through alleyways until they reached the church. Ruth hadn't stepped foot in it in years. It was there she'd once turned Holt down, right there in front of the altar, where he'd tried to make a wedding of it all, a deal sealed by God. She hadn't said no politely. She'd said it with a slap and a scream, and a broken bottle to his cheek. He hadn't bled much, but the stain had never come out of the floorboards. It was still there. She saw it now, dark and stubborn, and beside it, a man knelt, not praying, weeping. He turned at the sound of their approach, and Ruth froze. Micah, she whispered. Colt tensed beside her. The man stood slowly. He was taller than Colt, but leaner, face lined with sun and sorrow. His eyes, Colt's eyes, were grey and hollow. Brother, he said. Colt didn't speak. Ruth stepped forward. You said he was dead. Colt didn't answer. Micah smiled faintly. He did that a lot. Told stories instead of truths. Colt's jaw clenched. You're working for Holt. Micah shook his head. Not by choice. You always had a choice, Colt snapped. You left me no good ones. What are you doing here? Micah looked at Ruth then, and there was a long, slow kind of sadness in his voice. I came to warn you. Ruth blinked. Warn me? They're coming. Not men, not guns. Children. Holt's taken dozens, bought their silence, bought their fear, and he's marching them through town tonight in chains. Colt stepped forward. Why? To remind the town who owns their children, and to draw you out. Ruth's breath caught. He's baiting me. Micah nodded. He's got your name on every wanted poster from here to the Colorado line, claims you shot Dawson, claims you burned the garrison in Gable Creek, claims you stole government gold. All lies. Doesn't matter, Micah said. The town believes what they're told. And right now, they're being told to come see the hanging of the outlaw Ruth Winslow and her bastard girls. Colt looked to Ruth. We need to get those kids out. We will, she said. Tonight. Micah stepped aside. Then follow me. I know the back paths. They moved like shadows, past silent homes, past men too scared to speak. The town square was lit bright, a bonfire crackling in the middle. And there, chained in a circle, dressed in rags, were children, some barely older than Ruth's own. On the gallows, Holt stood in a cream coat, hands folded. His face was calm, smiling. People of Lockridge, he called. Tonight we cast out the vermin. Tonight we take back what's ours. Tonight. A shot rang out, not from the gallows, from the chapel. A lantern shattered above Holt's head, flames leaping across the platform. Panic exploded. People screamed, children cried. Guards rushed forward. And in the chaos, Ruth and Colt moved. They cut chains. They lifted children. Micah fired again, dropping a man trying to raise his rifle. Then Colt froze. A girl screamed. Not any girl. Leah. Ruth spun. Leah was in a man's arms, one of Holt's riders, dragging her toward the jail. Ruth didn't think. She ran. Colt beside her. Micah behind. They crashed through the door just as the man turned, gun raised. Colt shot first. Leah fell to her knees, sobbing. Ruth caught her. Outside, the fire roared. Inside, Ruth held her daughter and whispered, We're not done. Not yet, but I swear to you we will be. Because this time the storm had a face, and Ruth was going to drag it into the light. Smoke clawed its way into the rafters of Lockridge's jailhouse, turning every breath into ash and every corner into a blur. Ruth held Leah tight, her heartbeat like a hammer against the child's ear. And when she looked back over her shoulder, she didn't see salvation. She saw Colt, standing just behind her, shoulders hunched, revolver drawn but eyes elsewhere. Not lost, locked, on the door, on something beyond it. Move, he barked, voice edged with something sharp and not entirely fear. Ruth didn't hesitate. She scooped Leah into her arms and sprinted toward the side exit. Micah had already slipped through and was ushering the other children they'd freed down an alley into the shadow of the courthouse. The fire in the square was drawing half the town's attention, and the rest were still in shock. But it wouldn't last. Holt's men were regrouping, the same way snakes do when you stomp on their nest. Quieter, deadlier. Colt fired once more and ducked out, covering Ruth's retreat. When the door slammed behind him, he didn't speak, just grabbed her elbow and ran. They moved like ghosts, slipping through the back lanes, past the church where it had all started, through gardens and woodpiles and over fences that hadn't seen use in years. Every step was stolen time, and Ruth knew time was the one thing Holt never loaned without interest. Behind the apothecary, Greer waited with the horses. He'd rounded them up from the mill and had them hidden beneath a thick net of hay and smoke-damp tarps. His eyes widened at the sight of the children, more than a dozen now, all wide-eyed and trembling. But he didn't ask questions. He helped, hoist them up two to a saddle, and by the time the last foot was in a stirrup, the bells were ringing in town square. Not for church, not for warning, for blood. Holt's put a price on your head, Greer muttered to Ruth as she mounted. Dead or alive, she glanced over at Colt. And his. Greer's mouth twitched. Double. They rode hard out of town, following the river east. The sky cracked open before dawn with the sound of thunder that wasn't thunder. It was men. dozens of riders fanning out behind them. The chase had begun, but the woods past the bluff were thick, and Colt knew them better than any man alive. They twisted through narrow canyons, forded icy creeks, and took shelter by day in caves so tight Ruth had to press the girls against her chest just to breathe without echo. Food ran low, water lower. Still, the children didn't complain. Maybe because they knew better. Or maybe because Ruth never let herself break in front of them. Not even when her hands trembled from cold or her boots split from the shale. One night, after a sharp climb into a pine hollow, Colt set traps while Greer took first watch. Ruth sat with Micah, tending to a child's blistered feet. The boy couldn't have been more than 5, but he bore the silence of someone who'd seen 10 years too much. "I thought you were dead," she said softly, not looking at Micah. "I was," he said, matching her tone. "Why come back?" Micah scratched his beard, eyes on the firelight dancing through the brush. "Because I owed Colt more than my silence, and I owed you. More than running." She looked up. "You didn't owe me anything." "I did, because I knew what Holt was even then, and I let him tie you to that fence post." The air between them went still. "You watched?" she asked. "I didn't just watch. I held the rope." Her hands froze on the child's bandage. She didn't speak for a long time. Then, "Why tell me now?" "Because I want you to know who's riding with you, and who isn't riding with Holt anymore." She stared at him, and there was no fire in her voice, just something cold and final. "Then you better make sure you never leave my sight, because the only reason you're breathing is because my girls are watching." Micah nodded. He didn't flinch, didn't offer forgiveness. The days blurred. One child fell sick. Another twisted an ankle. Leah kept close to her mother, never complaining, but Ruth saw the shadows growing under her eyes. Every mile wore heavier. But still, they pushed on, toward the one place Colt said they could stand their ground. Copper Ridge. It wasn't a town anymore, just bones of one. An old mining camp that had collapsed under greed and bad luck. But it had tunnels, high walls, and one narrow pass that could be held by 3 men with enough grit and gunpowder. They reached it by dusk on the 5th day. No sooner had they lit a fire than the scouts arrived. 3 riders from Holt's crew. Greer dropped one from 70 yards with a borrowed rifle. The others fled, but they'd be back, with more. Ruth knew it now. They weren't going to outrun this. Not anymore. They had to end it. That night, she made Colt tell her everything. Not about Holt, about the ring, about the woman Dawson mentioned. He resisted at first, but then, with only the fire between them and the girls asleep beside the horses, he told her. She wasn't my wife, not truly. We were kids. 19 maybe. She found me half dead in a canyon east of sundown, nursed me back, said I reminded her of someone she lost. I didn't have a name back then, or maybe I just didn't want one. She gave me hers. For a while, I lived like I was her husband, because it made her smile. Because I wanted to believe. Someone like me could be worth that. Ruth said nothing. She died trying to save someone else. A little girl caught in the river. I couldn't reach them in time. They both drowned. I buried her under a cottonwood tree, left the ring there, thought it was over. Then I saw Dawson wearing that tree on his belt buckle. And the ring. Gone. Ruth leaned back, arms folded. So, you've been running from a past you never really lived. I've been running from the man I became after it. She nodded slowly, then stood. We stopped running tonight. She spent the rest of the night preparing, sealing the tunnels, reinforcing the western ridge, moving the children into the deepest shaft with enough supplies for 2 days. Micah helped, silent and steady. Greer took the upper slope with the repeater, and Colt, without a word, began wiring the ridge with homemade explosives crafted from old mining powder and lantern oil. By dawn, the dust rose in the distance, Holt had arrived. He came with 30 men. Some Ruth recognized from the square. Others wore no markings, just hunger in their eyes. He stopped just beyond the canyon mouth, dismounted, and stepped forward like he was walking into a Sunday sermon. His coat was spotless, his boots gleamed. "Ruth," he called, voice loud and casual. "Ruth Winslow. You've got something that belongs to me." She stepped up onto the ridge. "You've got nothing I want, Holt," he smiled. "Oh, I think I do. I've got every lawman in the territory 3 days behind me. I've got $50 a head on every child you stole. And I've got the patience of a man who knows time always favors the noose. You tied me to a fence post once. You want to try again? You come get me yourself." He chuckled. "You really think a pile of broken rocks and broken men is going to stop me?" "No," she said. "But I think they'll slow you down long enough to wish you never came." He didn't blink. He just turned, raised his hand, and all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from the canyon mouth. Greer's rifle sang from above. Micah lit the first charge, and the leftmost path collapsed in a hail of fire and shale. Colt emerged from a side shaft with a pistol in each hand, cutting down 2 men before the others scattered. Ruth didn't wait. She ran to the main breach, fired once, twice, reloaded. Her shoulder burned where a bullet grazed her, but she didn't flinch. Not now. Not after everything. And then, silence. Not the kind that comes when everyone's dead, the kind that comes when someone stops firing. Colt wasn't at the breach. Ruth ran. She found him near the shaft entrance. Bleeding. A bullet had torn. Through his side. Bad. Deep. Micah crouched beside him, trying to staunch the wound. "He's alive. But he won't be if we don't move now." Greer stumbled up, limping. "Holt's retreating. Half his men are gone, but he's not done." Ruth knelt beside Colt. His eyes opened, barely. "You good?" she whispered. He smiled faintly. "Always." "We'll finish this," she said. "You rest." But Colt grabbed her wrist, tight. "No. You finish him." The sky above them turned gold with firelight and dust. Ruth stood. One last path remained open. One last chance to end it. And Holt was still out there, waiting. The fire smoldered low in the canyon as Ruth Winslow stood alone at the pass. Behind her, Colt lay pale and bleeding beneath makeshift bandages. Greer and Micah crouched nearby, faces grim with fatigue, and the children, every last one of them, huddled in the back of the collapsed shaft, silent, waiting. But Ruth heard nothing now. No sobs, no crack of gunfire, no wind across the ridge. Just her boots scuffing on broken stone and the long, slow click of the rifle in her hands. Holt hadn't run. Not far anyway. He never did. She knew exactly where he'd be, and so she went to him. Down the side path, skirting the bloodied rocks and shattered bodies, she stepped over one of Holt's men, still gasping for air, and didn't look back. Not until the canyon gave way to the clearing beyond, where the trees stood thin and winter-scorched, and where the long shadow of Holt himself waited beneath, the skeleton of a twisted juniper tree. He didn't draw, didn't move, just leaned on a half-buried fence post. That same damn fence post, the one they'd brought from Lockridge, the one she'd been tied to, left in the sun until the buzzards circled, until her legs gave out, and her voice went hoarse from screaming, and no one, not one soul, came to cut her down, except a stranger with a bullet in his shoulder and no name. "You look tired," Holt called, like they were meeting at a crossroads, not the edge of the world. "You always get quiet when you're cornered, Ruth." She didn't answer, just raised her rifle. He held up a hand, not in surrender, but as if calming a skittish horse. "I didn't come here to kill you." "That's too bad. Because I came to kill you." He smiled. "No, you didn't. You came to feel something. You think if you spill my blood, it'll make you whole again. Make the girl who got left behind in that dirt patch disappear. But that girl ain't gone. She's still in there, still screaming. Maybe, but she's not tied up anymore. I gave you a way out, he said, pushing off the post. A name, a home, a life. You spit on it. You call that life? He stepped closer. Ruth didn't lower the rifle. You think you're any better than me now, he said. Running with a murderer, dragging kids through blood and smoke. You think that makes you some kind of savior? No, you're worse, because you pretend you're doing it for them. I never pretended, she said, voice low. You should have married me. You should have stayed buried in whatever hole spat you out. They stood there, the distance between them filled with ghosts. Of every man Holt had beaten into silence, every girl he'd traded like cattle, every threat, every scar, every damn Sunday sermon where he sat at the front pew pretending to be holy while the rest of the town bowed their heads and shut their mouths. And then he drew. But she was faster. The rifle cracked once, twice, then again. The third shot struck him center chest. Holt staggered backward, blood blooming like ink across his shirt. He tried to fire, but his gun dropped before his fingers could find the trigger. He dropped to one knee, then to none. Still breathing. Barely. Ruth walked up and stood over him. You gonna finish it? He gasped. I already did. And she walked away. Behind her, the children would never know what mercy tasted like, but they would learn what freedom did. Back at the ridge, Colt was slipping. His skin had gone cold and waxy, and the bandage Micah had tied around his middle was soaked through again. Ruth knelt, took his hand, and whispered something none of the others could hear. He opened his eyes once, just long enough to see her face. And for the first time since she'd known him, he smiled without sorrow. Then his grip loosened. His breath caught and stopped. Ruth didn't cry. She kissed his forehead, whispered, "Thank you," and stood. Micah stepped forward. "I'll dig it." "No," she said. "We all will." They buried him where the canyon met the sun, on high ground, where the wind would find him, where no name was needed and no law could reach. Greer carved a crude marker from a length of pine. Leah placed a stone on it. Then another child placed a flower, and another, until the grave wasn't alone anymore. They rode out at first light. Ruth led the way. There was no town waiting for them. No promised land. Just miles of dirt, river, and open sky. But she carried the children like she carried the scars, not as burdens, but as proof. That she'd lived, that she'd survived, that something good could still grow from the blood of what had been. Micah rode beside her, quiet but steady. Greer whistled sometimes to keep the kids from dozing. And Ruth, she never looked back. They crossed 3 counties before Ruth stopped near a cluster of cottonwoods, beside a clean, shallow stream. The land was raw, untamed, but it was theirs. "This is it?" Micah asked. She nodded. "This is it." They built cabins from scratch, dug a well, grew food from dust and stubbornness. The children helped. Some of them even laughed again. Ruth taught them how to ride, how to read, how to shoot when they were ready. She gave them names if they didn't have them, kept the ones who did, and little by little the camp grew. Word spread. More children came. More women with bruises and no last names. More men like Greer and Micah, trying to balance old sins with new paths. They called it Cottonwood Post. It never appeared on a map. But folks knew that if you needed a second chance, or a first, you went west until the trees bent low and the wind carried the sound of hammers and laughter. And every morning, Ruth Winslow stood at the edge of that clearing and watched the sun rise over the ridge where Colt was buried. She wore no ring, carried no picture, but she carried his memory in the way she refused to bow, to break, or to run, because she didn't need saving anymore. She was the one doing the saving. And sometimes, at night, When the wind blew just right, she could still hear him. A whisper behind her shoulder, a shadow in the trees, a promise made good. Because even outlaws sometimes come back, especially when the woman they owed their life to is tied to a fence post and still finds the strength to stand.